Welcome to Political Perspectives. I'm Hugo Gurdon, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Examiner, and I'm joined today by Byron York, Chief Political Correspondent, who is up in New York and has just been attending the vice presidential debate between Senator J.D. Vance and Governor Tim Walz. So, Byron, thanks for joining us. Let's go straight to that debate. J.D. Vance turned in what to me seemed like one of the best debate performances I've seen either from presidents or vice presidents in the, I don't know how many election cycles. He was fluent, evidently smart, managed to deal with all sorts of situations. Tim Walz was a really strong contrast to that. He looked shaky, he looked unconfident, and he got better as the debate went by, but he was never nearly as strong. Was that contrast a surprise?
Not really. It was, you're right, Vance was a good substance and good tone. So he did really, really well. Now, if you remember, as far as Walz is concerned, there were actually a couple of stories in the run-up to the debate of people saying that that Walz is nervous and he's not really a good debater. And a lot of observers dismissed that as expectation setting, trying to not raise expectations too high beforehand. But now it appears that was actually true. It was just a leak, so they knew he wasn't doing well. So he really did poorly. And after the debate, I asked Chris LaCivita, who is the co-manager of Trump's campaign. I said, well, what's the key moment? What's the most important moment for you in the debate? And he said, the first 20 seconds. I said, wow, really? In what way? And he said, well, the question focused on all of the trouble in the world and dealing with that trouble in the world. And he was nervous and fidgety and unsure of himself right there. And he said that set the tone of the debate for the whole time.
Yeah, well, I want to look at actually another clip. I thought that certainly that Walz's first minute or so was pretty much a disaster for him, and even though he did get stronger. But nevertheless, he continued to make errors. And I'd like to have a look at a couple of clips where the CBS moderators put each candidate on the spot, Walz and Vance. Let's just have a look at those clips.
Look, I will be the first to tell you, I have poured my heart into my community. I've tried to do the best I can, but I've not been perfect. And I'm a knucklehead at times, but it's always been about that. Those same people elected me to Congress. Many times I will talk a lot. I will get caught up in the rhetoric. But being there, the impact it made, the difference it made in my life, I learned a lot about China.
And sometimes, of course, I've disagreed with the president, but I've also been extremely open about the fact that I was wrong about Donald Trump. I was wrong, first of all, because I believed some of the media stories that turned out to be dishonest fabrications of his record. But most importantly, Donald Trump delivered for the American people. And yeah, when you screw up, when you misspeak, when you get something wrong and you change your mind, you ought to be honest with the American people about it. It's one of the reasons, Margaret, why I've done so many interviews is because I think it's important to actually explain to the American people where I come down on the issues and what changed.
So, Byron, that was a very striking contrast.
Very.
Vance immediately said, I was wrong. And he's obviously been saying that now in the 70 or more interviews that he's done, and where he's been asked that same question. So he was very well prepared for it. But he came across as this forthright, look, that's what I thought. Here are the reasons I thought it, but I was wrong. Trump was great, whatever. Walz was asked, he's done obviously very few interviews, he didn't address it. He kind of wanted to come across as that sort of, well, or shucks, small town guy, parochial sort of feel, I'm a knucklehead. So he actually entrenched and magnified the problem, whereas Vance dealt with it, immediately.
Yeah.
It's real contrast.
Well, CBS made sure to ask each candidate one question that was going to make them personally uncomfortable. And you described very well how Vance handled his question. And Walz just totally mangled his question. And it was the question about his claims, which were not just once or twice or three times, but repeated claims to have been in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen Square period that were not true. He was in Nebraska. And he just bumbled it. He went all over the place for a paragraph or so, talking about his childhood in Nebraska. And then, which you mentioned, he described himself as a knucklehead, said he gets caught up with the rhetoric, which is kind of doing a good job of suggesting that he does not have the seriousness and the gravitas to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. You think this guy's maybe too emotional for this. Right. Now, on the Vance thing, it is interesting. I spoke to somebody who's a veteran of Vance's Senate campaign, and in 2022 runs for Senate in Ohio, and he had 75 plus town hall meetings. And at every single one of those, somebody stood up and said, boy, you know, you used to hate Trump and now you like him. What's going on? And so Vance has answered that question dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And as you said, he had a very good answer, the best part of which was, I was wrong.
Right. Byron, I want to ask you a question which I had to ask you on a previous debate, and that is about apparent bias in the moderators. The rules of this debate were that they were not going to be doing fact checking, and at one point when they were talking about immigration, and they fact checked J.D. Vance, and he insisted on coming back at them because their fact check was wrong, and then they shut off his mic.
Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on.
Thank you, Senator.
That is the facilitation of illegal immigration, Margaret, by our own
Thank you, Senator, for describing the legal process.
We
have so much to get to, Senator.
Those laws have been on the books since 1990.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The CBP app has not been on the books since 1990. It's something.
How do you think CBS did, and how badly do you think they displayed their favoritism towards the Democrats?
Well, they certainly looked terrible at that moment that you just described, because in addition to that, Vance and Walz were starting to get into it a little bit, which is often the most interesting part of a debate. And that's when the moderators turned off the microphone. I mean, it just absolutely made no sense. And CBS had made a big deal, I think, trying to suggest that they were going to do better than ABC had done. And of course, ABC in the Trump-Harris debate had done a lot of fact-checking, but only of Trump, not of Harris. And they looked terrible and biased. So CBS comes out and says, well, in this debate, we are not going to fact-check. That is up to the candidates to each fact check each other as part of the debate, which would have been fine, except that when Vance referred to Haitians who were in the country, he said illegally. I think it was Margaret Brennan decided to fact check him and say, no, Senator, they were here legally. And it's just so you know. Well, here you have a situation where, no, he wasn't fact-checking Walz. He needed to fact-check the moderators' fact-check because he pointed out there is this app that the Biden administration has created for Haitians who are in the country illegally to push a button and be here legally. And Vance thought that was important information, and it was, and CBS was willing to cut off his mic to stop people from hearing it.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary moment. Let's have a look at another clip, and it's where I think it gets to something which Vance did very well, and it's where he says Tim Walz has a difficult job to do. Let's have a look at that clip.
So what Tim Walz is doing, and I honestly, Tim, I think you got a tough job here, because you've got to play whack-a-mole. You've got to pretend that Donald Trump didn't deliver rising take-home pay, which of course he did. You've got to pretend that Donald Trump didn't deliver lower inflation, which of course he did. And then you simultaneously got to defend Kamala Harris's atrocious economic record, which has made gas, groceries, and housing unaffordable for American citizens.
So what he did there, and what he did, I think, repeatedly, really quite effectively throughout the debate, is come back to the point that one doesn't need, and voters do not need, to speculate about how the two candidates for the presidency would perform in office, because they know how. There is a record to look at. Trump was in office and inflation was low, the world was not at war, and various other things. Harris has been in office with Joe Biden. Inflation roared away to its highest for 40 years, and there were various other things which, the job creation wasn't as great, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the key thing that Vance needed to do was to make voters remember and realize that Harris is not the candidate of something new. She is the candidate of continuity with the Biden administration. I think he did that rather well. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that that was the so-called whack-a-mole moment, which I think was one of Vance's better ones, which is doing exactly what you're saying, which is saying, look, Walz is trying to tell you that Donald Trump didn't create jobs. He didn't create a good economy. He didn't not have inflation. When in fact, we all know those things were true of Donald Trump. He did create jobs. He had a good economy. Inflation was low. You know all that. And at the same time, he's trying to tell you that the Biden-Harris economic record, which is terrible, is good. And so you don't believe it. And by the way, at the end of that little segment, Vance brought up his own sometimes impoverished childhood and said, look, I know what it's like to not have enough money to get by. And believe me, we can do better. It was a very, very strong appeal.
Yeah, and that brings me to the final question, which is about, you mentioned J.D. Vance's tone right at the beginning of our discussion here.
Yeah.
And he was referring to himself. He did, it seems to me, very deliberately try and make himself more appealing as a person, as a personality. He's obviously very smart. He can talk very aggressively off the cuff. But what he seemed to be doing last night in the politeness, actually both candidates were very polite and sort of rather amicable with each other, and often said that they kind of agreed in some ways with each other. But Vance was not interrupting. He was not aggressive. He didn't seem angry. He kind of had he was wearing a pink tie. There was something kind of humanizing about him. Do you think that this was very much a deliberate effort by the Trump-Vance campaign to make him more appealing to sections of the voting of voters where he's a bit weak at the moment?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at there can be a couple of J.D. Vances. He is a candidate. He's just now turned 40. He's been online kind of all of his life. He's online a lot, and there's kind of an online J.D. Vance. But last night you had an audience that was all of the broadcast networks, the old-fashioned dinosaur broadcast networks, plus all of the cable news networks, plus probably a bunch of other places where people could watch this debate. It was going to be the biggest, most mainstream audience he's ever gotten. This wasn't a couple of people listening to a podcast. So he did, I think, tailor his presentation and his demeanor to do that. And now he sanded down a few of his rough edges, and it was very, very effective.
Yeah, and we'll just have to wait to see if that makes a difference. There's always a question with vice presidential debates and with vice presidents themselves about how much difference they make to a ticket's success or failure. But that's something we'll watch. And Byron, we'll be back to talk about that next time. Thanks very much for joining us. And thank you all for joining us on Political Perspectives.